Romans chapter 4, I want to read for just a second from the 13th verse and read a few verses from where Paul ministers some things about the righteousness of God and about His goodness and about His grace. And Paul was really trying to introduce the reader to understanding that their Christianity was not based upon what they could do. It was based upon a covenant older than Moses' covenant, the covenant of Abraham's promise, in which God blessed a man named Abraham and didn't require anything from Abraham. Just told him, if you'll go, I'll bless you. If you'll believe, I'll bless you. Listen to Romans chapter 4, verse 13. For the promise that he would be heir of the world was not to Abraham or to his seed through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. For if those who are of the law are heirs, faith is made void, and the promise is made of no effect. Because the law brings about wrath, for where there is no law, there is no transgression. I really want to hone in on that 15th verse. And if you're looking at your hard copy, take another look. Because notice the last part of that verse, really important. Where there is no law, there is no transgression. And why that's important is because what makes sin explode in our lives is the introduction of the law. What makes sin explode in our lives is the moment that you put something off limits. The moment that it's off limits, that's when I want to do it. When I look at the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and this is one of the go-to moments for me in the Scriptures. So I always go back to that thought of Adam hiding himself in the bushes, covering himself over with fig leaves, just trying his best to hide himself from a God that he was pretty sure was going to be ticked off. Because what Adam does in the garden is eats from a tree he's told not to eat from, and he looks down and realizes that he's naked. And he's embarrassed. So he runs off into the bushes, hides himself, covers himself up. And every day God has an appointment with Adam, in which the Bible says in Genesis that God shows up and speaks to Adam in the cool of the day. He just has a conversation with Adam that must have been pretty phenomenal. And Adam is so embarrassed to face God in this current state that he runs and hides in the bushes, so that when God shows up in the garden, Adam is doing everything in his power to make sure that he doesn't get found out in the midst of his nakedness. And whenever I see that conversation, I'm so impressed by what Adam hears God say upon entry into the garden. And it is, Adam, where are you? And Adam's response is, I'm hiding out in the bushes. And God says, why are you hiding in the bushes? And Adam says, because I'm naked. And God says, how did you know that you were naked? And Adam begins to tell the story of what happened. And actually, Adam blames his wife, and his wife blames the snake, and on down the line. But what amazes me about the story is that when God walks into the garden, God walks into the garden. I mean, under my idea, I was raised in religion. I was raised, go to church and do everything you can to try to please God. And if you fail, you better be ready for God to come and get you. You better be ready for God to be sure your sin will find you out. I heard that quoted so many times. That's from Deuteronomy, by the way. That was God saying to Moses, tell Israel they will always get caught when they fail. And so I live my life by that premise. Be sure your sin will find you out. You're not going to get by with lying. You're not going to get by with cheating. You're not going to get by with stealing. You're not going to get by with... God's going to find you out. So there was this perpetual fear inside of, going to church was... And I had to go because, my dad was a preacher, and so that's what you did. You went to church. So, I was scared to death to go and face a God who was watching my every move every day. Why I say it amazed me that God even bothered to show up was because I was convinced that God did not show up when I sinned. In fact, God stayed away. If my sin was going to find me out, why would God want to hang out with me if I was failing? And yet in the book of Genesis, there's God. He walks into the garden after Adam's already sinned, and he says, hey, Adam, where are you? And so this began to run over my spirit over and over and over again. Everybody always told me sin separates you from God. I hear preachers say it all the time. It's not hard. Just turn on a radio station or a TV station or click a podcast, find somebody preaching the gospel, and they're going to tell you, almost inevitably, when you fail, you're separated from God. You need to come back to God because you've fallen away. And yet there's God. walking and talking with Adam in the garden and letting Adam know how much he cares for him and letting Adam know that it didn't run him away. And so it convinces me that sin is not what separates people from God. I think sin separated me in my mind from God a bunch. In fact, I would fail and I wouldn't go to God out of fear because I didn't want to confess, or I didn't want to own up to it, or quite frankly, I just didn't want to go deal with it, you know? So I'd stay away from God, maybe mentally, maybe spiritually check out. If anybody was separated, it was me. It wasn't God. God was right there the whole time, and I was freaking out and running away. Sin isn't what separated Adam from God. What separated Adam from God was the knowledge of the law. Because here's the issue. When God put Adam in the beautiful Garden of Eden, God didn't give him any other instruction except don't eat from that one tree. And that was all Adam needed. Because what is so big about eating from one tree? Now, I think we're asking the wrong question, because that was me in Sunday school as a kid. Why does God tell him don't eat from that tree? Big deal. Who cares, you know? It's like putting a sign on that door that says do not enter. It's probably not that cool behind that door anyway. But the moment you put do not enter, what's everybody want to do? Well, I mean, maybe I'm the only one, but if given the opportunity, I'm at least going to take a peek. Try to figure out why nobody wants me in that room. So I'm like, well, who cares that you're not supposed to eat from this tree? What's the big deal about the tree? It doesn't matter what the law was. The fact that God gave a law meant that in that moment, Adam had something he could break. And in that moment, of course, the serpent goes after Eve. And a question I always ask people is, have you ever wondered why the snake didn't slither down from that tree and say to Eve, hey, why don't you kill Adam? You can have the whole garden. And I wondered that before. Why didn't he? I mean, he could have just ended the whole family of man right there. Pretty impossible for Eve to have her baby if there's no Adam. So I'm going, why doesn't the enemy really stick it to God by saying, go kill Adam, you can have the whole place? And the Holy Spirit spoke into my heart and said it was impossible for that to be a temptation to Eve because God had not told her, thou shalt not kill. And since there was no law against killing, the enemy didn't have a weapon to use against Eve. What was the only thing she was told not to do? Don't eat from that tree. What's the only thing the snake tried to get her to do? Eat from that tree. Now, what empowers sin? What empowers sin in our life is the moment the law is reintroduced to us. The moment that something is put in front of us that is on limits, off limits, whatever, in that moment we develop what we perceive to be God's boundaries. And if we're going to push anything, we're going to push against the legal limit of the law. So then you get all the way up in the book of Exodus and God gives them a bunch of them. I mean, list after list after list of laws. And did you notice that from that moment on, Israel begins to sin, and sin starts to become the theme of the Bible. Now, what is interesting is that when Adam and Abraham in the book of Genesis, whenever they sinned or whenever they failed, you don't see God separating himself from Adam. You don't see God separating himself from Abraham. And Abraham, guys, commits adultery and more than once. And Abraham lies about his own marriage more than once. Puts his family in harm's way more than once. And never one time does God come to Abraham in the book of Genesis and say, kill a lamb as a sacrifice for your sin. Why doesn't God tell Abraham to kill a lamb? Because God did not put Abraham under the law. The law's not given until Exodus 20. So all the way up until Exodus 20, God, who has not given man a law, can't be offended by man breaking law. Where's the law? There is none. In fact, what was our text? Romans 4:15. The law brings about anger. I'm adding the word anger because we got the big word wrath there. It's not a word we use a whole lot, but anger is a word we understand. The law brings about anger. For where there is no law, there is no transgression. What does that mean? If you remove the law, what do you remove? The transgression. Does that mean that they didn't do anything? No, they still did it. But if it's not against the law, it can't be considered a transgression. Now what that says to me, and I don't want to read anything into the text, so we'll stay at work on Paul's passage. But what that says to me is that if you were to remove the restriction, it wouldn't be wrong. Does anybody else read it that way? If you were to remove, what if God had removed the restriction against eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? Well, she could have ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Big deal. No restriction. It probably wouldn't even been that big a temptation. I mean, the devil didn't come to her and ask her, why don't you eat from the banana tree? Because there was no restrictions against eating from the banana tree. She could eat from the banana tree all day long. It wasn't a big deal. But the one she wasn't supposed to eat from. So Paul catches that. And he says to the Romans, he says, if you were to remove the law, you would remove the transgression.